On the afternoon of April 14th, 1935, families across the American Great Plains were enjoying a calm, quiet Sunday. Children were playing outside, and the air was perfectly still. Then, people noticed a sudden, unnerving drop in temperature. They looked toward the northern horizon and saw a thin, dark line. Within minutes, that line expanded, rising up and racing directly toward them. It was a literal mountain of loose earth. Reaching nearly 2,000 feet high, this suffocating wall of dust was moving across the landscape at the speed of a freight train. As the storm hit civilization, it swallowed whole towns in an instant. Broad daylight vanished. The sky turned entirely black, and streetlights had to be switched on in the middle of the afternoon. Inside their homes, families were trapped. The dust was so fine it poured through closed windows and tiny cracks in the walls. Parents scrambled to wrap wet cloths around their children's faces, just so they could take a breath without choking on the air itself. That afternoon would go down in history as Black Sunday, the most devastating natural disaster the United States had ever seen. The power of the storm to displace entire farms was a consequence of how the land had been managed in the years leading up to 1935. By clearing the natural landscape, human expansion had stripped the earth of its primary defenses. To understand how the soil collapsed, we have to look at what the Great Plains used to be. For thousands of years, this region was an endless ocean of tall native prairie grasses that maintained a stable ecosystem. This cross-section shows exactly how that ecosystem survived. Beneath the surface, the native grass grew massive, deep root systems. These roots acted like a dense underground net, gripping the thick topsoil securely and holding it in place through violent winds and severe droughts. But when millions of acres of this prairie were plowed over to plant commercial wheat, that natural anchor was sliced away. The deep native roots were replaced by sparse, shallow wheat roots. The soil particles were suddenly disconnected, sitting loose and exposed on the surface. Federal incentives and the promise of massive wheat profits had fueled a rapid agricultural boom. This encouraged settlers to plow under as much native prairie as possible to capitalize on high market demand. The process was accelerated by new industrial technology. Heavy gas-powered tractors allowed a single farmer to plow huge swaths of land in a fraction of the time, churning up the dry earth and destabilizing millions of acres. The final blow came in 1931. The seasonal rains stopped. The brutal heat of the drought baked the unanchored topsoil, turning it into millions of tons of dry, lifeless powder. Mechanized plowing and a lack of rain had converted the topsoil into a layer of disconnected dust. Without the native roots to hold the ground together, the entire region was left at the mercy of the wind. When the worst of the storms finally passed, families opened their doors to a ruined world. Entire farms, vehicles, and heavy equipment were completely swallowed by layers of drifted sand. The infrastructure they relied on to survive was buried. The air itself remained toxic. Hospitals quickly filled with patients suffering from dust pneumonia, a condition where microscopic soil particles clogged the lungs of the elderly and the young. Everyday people had to wear heavy industrial masks just to walk outside. Farming families were backed into a corner. With their crops dead and their land suffocating them, they faced a devastating ultimatum: abandon the homesteads their families had built for generations, or stay and risk starvation. Thousands chose to flee. They packed whatever belongings they could fit into overloaded cars and wooden traimers, heading west along Route 66 in a desperate search for fertile land. By pushing the local ecosystem past its breaking point, agricultural practices had destroyed the region's ability to support human life. A localized farming failure created a wave of destitute refugees that spread across the entire country. California was supposed to be a place of opportunity, but when the refugees arrived, they found scarce jobs and extreme poverty, forced to live in massive, overcrowded camps made of fragile canvas tents packed tightly together in the dirt. Back on the plains, the U.S. government stepped in to stop the soil erosion. They launched massive federally funded conservation programs. This included planting millions of trees to create dense windbreaks, designed specifically to slow down the wind before it could pick up the soil. They also overhauled how farmers worked the earth. Instead of ripping straight lines across the plains, farmers learned to cut curved, terraced lines into the hillsides. These new techniques trapped rainwater and protected the integrity of the topsoil. The mechanics of the 1930s disaster remain relevant today. As climate change accelerates and severe droughts become more common, the risk of turning fertile land into barren dust is rising globally. Human civilization relies entirely on a few fragile inches of topsoil to sustain our populations. The Dust Bowl proved that when we ignore the physical limits of our environment, the consequences can last for generations. Long-term survival requires working with nature, rather than treating it like an obstacle to be conquered.